So inspiring. I'm going to pass the mic to Samia.
Morning. Good afternoon. Well, it says best practices, but usually my presumption is best means better than everyone else. But maybe I should call it some of the good practices. I think for DeCOALonize, as I mentioned earlier in the morning, our strategy is mainly focused on coal. However, we have a lot of partners who make up DeCOALonize who work generally on the fossil-free movement. There are others working on oil and gas, and I'll go into that more a little bit later. And just to clarify, so DeCOALonize is not an organization. I think that's actually one of the best things, the best decisions we made. We're not a registered organization. We're actually a movement. That has allowed us a lot of fluidity and to be amorphous in a way that the government can never come for you. People don't even know how to attack you because you make up so many members and every member is unique. It allows us to also use the skill sets of different players. I'm a member of DeCOALonize as an individual. I don't represent any organization. But we have Gino, for example, here, who's from Natural Justice, which is a legal entity working on legal advocacy and natural resource rights promotion. Then you have Anne, who's in the audience, from the Kenya National Resource Alliance, which is an alliance of organizations in Kenya. There are many others. We have Greenpeace, we have who are in the group. We have partners, not just members, like 350 is a partner. You see Glenn at the back there. So who is DeCOALonize? We get that a lot. And that has helped us become more inclusive. It's helped us become very amorphous and harder to fight. I think to summarize what has made it possible for us, I think, easier, and to tackle the issue of, and I'd like to say, although I say fossil free, but in Kenya we have oil and gas and coal, and those are fights. I think the biggest challenge we've had is how do you merge those two. It's much easier to talk about no coal in Kenya than to talk about no oil and gas, no oil exploration, especially because of the political dynamics at the moment. I think the first time they found oil in Kenya, there was a lot of excitement, there was a lot of investment made by individuals, and one of our partners, the Friends of Lake Turkana, one of our members, has actually been on the forefront of fighting for fossil-free movement in the north of Kenya. But how, for us, our focus has been, let's tackle this animal that we can so that it influences and acts as a catalyst for many others. So advocacy as an acronym for the multi-pronged approach that we have. A being action, 2 being diversity, 3 being the voices, 4, the organizations that make up a part of us. C is the actual campaigning that we've been doing in lobbying. A is accountability to the community, and C, communications, and Y is the simple fact of you and me, which I talked about earlier in the morning. Action-oriented activities. We've had so many demonstrations. I think what we've learned a lot is just, we've sent hundreds of petitions, hundreds of letters, trying to have meetings, but when it's not in the media, when it's not on the streets, when it's not the ordinary person raising a placard, it's easy to kind of put the letter underneath the pile and ignore it. And we've had a lot of support for non-direct action from different stakeholders, including Greenpeace. And diverse strategies and directed towards decision makers. Sorry, the PowerPoint seems to have shifted a little bit because of the formatting from the Mac, but I hope you can read that. So we've had forums and meetings to accompany that it's not just about talking to individuals to divest from coal, but how do we also put people together in public in a forum to discuss the issues, and public forums in the local communities as well as public forums in the national centers of Kenya and Nairobi. And I think bringing that dialogue to the ordinary Kenyans, where we actually had students who were the biggest participants in Nairobi. The #1 people who attended our forums in Nairobi were students from the University of Nairobi, which is quite interesting. And then V was the voice amplification, which was some of the issues discussed in my morning speech, was how do you support rather than duplicate the community's work. So we have members of DeCOALonize who are from the community. That's Save Lamu, who was the founder of DeCOALonize, and we have Chris, which is a Center for Human Rights and Civic Education. We're based in Kitui in the Moi Basin, fighting coal mining. At no particular moment do we say we are speaking for them. At no particular moment do we try to go in the ground and implement. That is not our values. And when we do have members who do that, we do put them in check and say, or is organizations working together, which I mentioned earlier, but how do we coordinate it? When Natural Justice and Katiba Institute was going to court to fight the coal plant, it wasn't just they're going to court, but what can we do at the same time? What can we do a week before to put pressure so when those judges come to court, they know they better rule our way? C is campaigning and lobbying leaders. I didn't mention it earlier, but I actually am a former, we'd say, political leader. I wasn't really a politician. I've always been an activist, but at one point I was working for the county government of Lamu. And lo and behold, Save Lamu especially was always on my case, calling me and messaging me, why aren't you speaking out? Why aren't you speaking out? And so when I finally resigned in protest against the project, and there were other fellow leaders who were campaigning, they were pushing behind the scenes for a very long time. And we continue that push as well. A is accountability to the community. So while we're working even in the national level, we're not working in isolation, that there are concurrent activities going on. That, for example, when we had a petition sent by Save Lamu, letter sent by Save Lamu to the Chinese Chinese embassy, it wasn't just about, well, okay, we'll help you send the letters and we'll take it for you to the embassy. No, it was, can we bring you to Nairobi? Can you come with us? We will go with you and we'll walk the mile with you to make sure you deliver that letter, and staying there and camping at the embassy until they accepted the letter for the community and protesting alongside. C was communication and access to information. We actually have some of our partners who are financing communications. We developed an online platform, a website, which has a repository of information so that anyone can access it. Anyone who wants information on it, be it for or against a project, can go online. Also providing social media and media coverage for local community events, and coordinating the efforts to make sure every Kenyan and every international organization knows what's going on the ground. Why is the you and me? And timely, because my time is up. You and me is, it's about everyone and every single role that we have to play for one purpose and one common goal. That every single thing we do matters and not at all excluding. An example here, this old man, and I use this photo intentionally because the old man with a mask saying DeCOALonize is from Kitui. He's been saving this piece of coal for so many times. He said, I've been waiting for a demonstration to be able to show, and he walked with this, he carried it in his pocket until he got to the Kenya Parliament, just so he can show a member of Parliament what coal really looks like. And it was a simple thing he did, but it got so much media coverage and so many photos just because of him holding a piece of coal. And I think that's what that is about. It's every single role that we have to play and how they all piece together to create a bigger story and more impact. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I was interested to see what freshness you would bring up to your excellent remarks this morning, and you brought it, so thank you so much. All right, moving on to Janet. We're gonna just have 2 more speakers, then we're gonna open up the room.
So this is much wonkier, than your exciting campaigns, and I feel a little bit like I shouldn't really be here because I can't really claim success after 6 years of trying to get the 2 biggest public pension funds in the states to divest. We have not succeeded. However, we have identified the barriers and we have taken them on in a reasonably creative way. So as we heard in an earlier presentation today, one of the things that the pension funds always bring up is their fiduciary duty to essentially maximize the short-term bottom line. And you can break that down into institutional inertia, long, boring commitment to something called modern portfolio theory, which sort of think like 50-year-old modern. They will say that they're passive investors, which means that they invest in index funds and they don't want to actively manage their portfolios, which is also a crock because they can ask any big investment company to give them a sleeve, a fund that doesn't have anything in it they want to exclude. And all of these excuses make them very comfortable saying that they're actively engaging with the fossil fuel companies and that this is their highest calling. And there's a terrible boondoggle called the Climate Action 100, which we all fight day and night, which is a lot of very large institutional investors who've gotten together and they said we're going to spend the next 5 years essentially talking to the oil companies about what they really ought to do, and they don't say what they're going to do at the end of the 5 years. I really do think it's a boondoggle. So we had to figure out how we were going to get around this barrage of excuses. And it seemed as if the heart of the problem is the definition of fiduciary duty. So the initial thought was to define fiduciary duty in law in a way that requires a fiduciary to consider climate, which is an anomalous risk. We proposed that in the legislature, and CalPERS and CalSTRS, which are politically very powerful in California.
What are CalPERS and CalSTRS?
They're the two biggest pension funds, the California Public Employees Retirement System and the California State Teachers Retirement System. Between them, they've got about $900 billion under management. So they weren't about to let the legislature redefine their fiduciary duty, although the legislature could have done that if they'd had the guts. So instead, we proposed defining climate-related financial risk, which is the term used by the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, defining that risk in law and requiring the funds to report on it. And I'm going to read you the definition, which, there's no internet down here. Wait a second. I had it a second ago. And Lisa Hamilton, who's sitting right there, was instrumental in the development of this definition. So this is what it is. Climate-related financial risk means risk that may include material financial risk posed to the fund by the effects of the changing climate, such as intense storms, rising sea levels, higher global temperatures, economic damages from carbon emissions, and other financial and transition risks due to public policies to address climate change, shifting consumer attitudes, changing economics of traditional carbon-intense industries. And miraculously, because the bill was so wonky, it passed. It also includes a reporting requirement, which says that the funds, unfortunately it's a 3-year schedule, but the first year is coming up at the end of this year. They need to identify the risk in their portfolio and report on it to the public and the legislature. They also need to report specifically on the results of shareholder engagement. And so we are now beating waiting on them to report as robustly as they can, with the intention that if they write horrible reports, we'll sue them. And if they write good reports and don't act, we'll sue them. And we were waiting to see what the result turns out to be and how good the reports are. But there's also interest in, this is the first law that has defined climate-related financial risk in the States. And it's similar to the French law that was passed in 2016. And there are other places that are way ahead of the States on this, but our pension funds are particularly recalcitrant. And we're hoping that other states will pick up some version of the California law. And I just have to say, it's wonderful to be working on this in California, where you really can get something done and lead the nation to some extent.
Thank you so much, Janet. That was great. And Janet is so humble. I mean, she's been one of the leading forces behind the passage of this bill, SB 964. And without her hard work, it wouldn't be a reality. And I love it. We're going to sue the pants off of them either way. Martin Norman, hailing from Norway. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Where to go after this? So, my name is Martin Norman, are based in Oslo. And coming from Norway is a bit of a weird thing, because we are 5.5 million people that owns, through our oil fund, the Norwegian government sovereign wealth fund, 1.5% of all available shares on the global market. It's $1 trillion fund. And being 5.5 million people, you know, everybody's somewhat related to somebody, and if not, you are not related, your friend is, or, you know, it's a very small and open society. But we are also extremely exposed to the whole oil industry. A lot of good things have been done in Norway to mitigate that situation with that natural resource. So our work is basically to change Norway as a whole. And this fund, or this piggy bank, it came at a perfect time, a moment when one of the Norwegian leading politicians said that, you know, Norway should divest from coal. It's like, what? We don't have any coal. We have a strategic coal mine in Svalbard, tiny one, that's it. So what does it mean? And we had positioned ourselves through years of oil work that we actually could define what that means. That means that the Norwegian oil fund should divest from oil. This was in 2013. And what we did, and I think that is something that we often forget, we actually spent a lot of time on power analysis. It's so easy to just run head on, at least campaigners tend to do that, but we spent a lot of time on power analysis. Who are the players? Who are they listening to? I mean, we were down to persons and names within the ministry, within the fund, within the government. I mean, we knew where people lived, you know? And it's not that, it's important so that you have the whole picture and you can sort of identify what are the things that needs to move for anything to happen. And we realized that there were 2 or 3 extremely important things that needed to happen. One, we needed to really dig into the finance of coal, because nobody in Norway knows anything about coal and finance, right? So we were looking outside of Norway. Who are the best experts on coal and finance? Well, AIFA. Good. Let's get Tom Sansillo to Oslo and talk to them.
What is AIFA?
Institute for Energy, Finance and Economics, sorry. Yeah.
It's an amazing think tank in the US that does a lot of analysis for the movement. It's called the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis.
Yes. And
never say it right.
no, I didn't mean it. And the second thing that we had to do was to, you know, Norwegians have no idea what coal is. Really don't. So we had to make it personal. So we brought affected people from all over the world, from all continents, to Oslo, to speak with both at a seminar in Parliament, and to do press work, and have one-on-one. Which means that then on one side you have, okay, we've killed the financial argument, and now it's personal. So basically, because of lack of legislation, we are basically killing these people. And then we, with this in mind, we called every organization that we knew. 350 of us, some of us, there was a whole lot of groups, and we set up, and this is important also, we did not do this alone. We do this together with other NGOs in Norway, and German Urgewald, who is one of the leading on analyzing the coal industry, was also key in this. We might have been orchestrating a little bit, but it's a joint effort. And then, so we made this huge public push on the politicians, and then we managed to get a unanimous parliament decision on a 30% criteria. And I have to say that even in the hours before, we never expected this to be such a clear win. So it's just a matter of timing and you know, the perfect storm coming your way, and you know, sun in the south and the wind from the west or whatever, you know, but it set such a, you know, clear standard for others to follow. And back then, this was in 2015, and back then that was sort of the new standard. And then from there on, we went to, okay, so what's next? And I have to admit, I was fairly high on adrenaline, I think, when I said, let's have a fossil-free oil fund by 2020. It sounds completely ridiculous, right? But why not? I mean, set the bar high. And again, we started this job with doing the analysis, right? Looking at all the bits and pieces, what needs to happen. And during that process, it's like, hey, what is this? The Ministry of Finance is talking about the need for diversification, like that, you know, that's the mantra of all these people. And at the same time, it's Norway owns the bank, or owns this money. And we also own Equinor, which is a state-owned oil company that we own 67%, and we own Ketoro that owns 25% of all the oil fields in Norway. So how does this look? And Greenpeace being not, you know, maybe not the strongest financial advisor in the world, I'm not known for that, so we hired some of the leading economists in Norway to look at that particular problem. And it came out that Norway is extremely overexposed to oil and gas. And that started a huge public debate among the finance people. Because they came out, you know, asset managers said, of course Norway should sell you know, have to mitigate it, we have to do something. And less than 8 months later, the board of the Norwegian Central Bank, which is also the board of the oil fund, sent a letter to the Minister of Finance and asking to please, can we sell all the oil and gas shares in the fund. As usual, the ministry does not like to be told what to do. So it ended up, unfortunately, in a decision where they're only selling upstream oil and gas companies for now. So we are not done yet, but still it goes back to the thing, you know, do the power analysis, know the players, know who to play on, give them the space. It's not, because I don't care, you know, I don't have to win. I can let somebody else win, as long as things changes. I think that's the important thing. And the only way we're going to do this is if we coordinate and do this together. Thank you.
So that's our panel. Thank you so much. We've heard a lot of interesting things. It's amazing how there's so many strategies, but how there are so many core elements that are the same. Power analysis, working with others, making sure that we have you know, done our homework before launching headlong. I think you've heard that across the board. And then, you know, the different ways that we make change happen. We do public actions, we do strikes, we do marches, but then we also have, you know, deep insider tactics where we're working with legislators, members of the finance ministry, members of the California state legislature to get this change done. So it's really fascinating. And the Norwegian example is just such a lighthouse for the rest of the world. It's a $1 trillion fund. And so when you guys divested from coal in 2015, it was a shockwave. It sent a huge signal that was then the inspiration for hundreds of divestment campaigns worldwide. So thank you, Martin, for your service and for all the organizations that worked with you. So I know that we don't have much time, so I really want to turn it to the room for questions. And so I will just open it up for questions for our panel. Okay. Yes, please. Oh, you first. Yes.
So I'm a recent graduate of the University of Massachusetts, Amherst.
Just one sec.
Just so we can get it recorded.
I'm a recent graduate of the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, which was the first public university to divest in the U.S.
Woo!
But I feel a bit of deja vu being in South Africa right now, because during the time when there was the push to divest, there were also many racially charged events and violence on our campus and in the country. And I was wondering what you would suggest for movements moving forward, incorporating the intersectionality of the issues, since we do live in a world where there are always so many different issues going on at the same time, unfortunately, that tend to overlap with each other.
Phenomenal question.
So, yeah. I mean, I certainly won't be able to answer this fully, but I can reflect a little bit on how students in the UK have made a start on this. There are a few universities that have begun to really deliberately, or student campaigns at universities that have begun to really deliberately run campaigns for fossil fuel divestment, for divestment from arms, and for wider kind of decolonizing the curriculum, also for justice in Palestine through the BDS movement in the same campaign. And some universities have kind of very explicitly and intentionally linked up those campaigns on campuses where they've happened, and kind of in the same way that we explained the kind of national network that we have, almost creating a similar, more micro network on the campus for like skill sharing resources, sharing strategies so they can target the same pressure points. But then also there are some campaigns that have done that in a much more bound together way, and they've said actually this is the same campaign. The kind of endpoint of intersectionality, where this isn't just kind of stitching together the links between these different issues, but saying actually this is a really broad movement for justice, we're going to have one strategy with one set of demands, and it's this list that really kind of narratively and in terms of the political education you're doing ties together things like climate justice, anti-imperialism, anti-racism, but also ties that together in terms of the practical demands that are being made.
I think that's an excellent question. I don't know if I can answer it, but I'd just like to add on it that not only race, but gender, and also for us, especially in Lamo, it's an issue of religion. And coincidentally, the same time the Lamo coal plant was started, there was also the highest number of extreme Islamic associated, I'm not going to say Islamic, but Islamic associated terror groups that took some violent actions in Lamo. And so that how to tackle the issue of marginalization of particular communities who have been disenfranchised for a long time, so that the issues are they're intertwined in a way. And it's hard to ignore it, because even in South Africa, you find a majority of the mines, a majority of not only mines, but coal power plants are nearby the black, poor communities. So you cannot separate the two. So coincidentally for us in Lamu, the coal power plant and the Lapsed project and oil and gas exploration coincidentally just happen to be where the Muslim community is. And so when you're trying to fight a project, but at the same time not be considered as a terrorist group and not be considered a sympathizer, it's very sensitive. So coincidentally, you have most of the community organizations supporting us are Muslim organizations, like the Muslim for Human Rights, which has been long supporting Save Lamu. So it's such, what do you call, you have to walk on glass almost on the two issues. So while it might be race for South Africa and the US, for us it's actually religion. That you have communities from where the port will be most affected by natural resource impact on fisheries are mostly Muslim. But the communities where will stand to benefit the most because they have the most title deed and the most land are not, who are more pro the project. So it's, I can't have the answer to it, but I just was pointing out that it can go across all type of community groups.
Did anyone else on the panel want to comment on that question? Next question. Okay, next question. And if you could just introduce yourself.
Okay. Lisa. Can you guys hear me? Okay, I think this one works. I'm Lisa. I'm from South North here in Capetown. I was just interested, James, in your presentation on when you said that a lot of Scottish churches did not divest, and I know a lot of environmental activists, NGOs, are accepting money from the Scottish churches. What would be the rule? I don't know what to call it, for NGOs that accept money from fossil fuel companies. Do we accept that funding, or how do we approach such things?
Well, in terms of accepting money from fossil fuel industry, I would say try and say no if you can. I'm sure everyone else too. But I mean, in terms of Scottish churches, there was an interesting one, and this is perhaps a sort of a learning point from our campaign as well. So about a month after the Church of Scotland debated whether to divest, the Scottish Episcopal Church, which is like the Anglican Church in Scotland, had a similar debate on divestment. And there'd been a story which had been reported in some of the national newspapers in the UK earlier in the year, basically saying that the church investors in the Scottish Episcopal Church wanted to weaken their ethical investment criteria, which you kind of thought was a bit of a crazy thing to do. And you can imagine that a lot of church members are quite unhappy with that. The reason that had been given was that the investor said, well, we're not making very good returns with our current ethical investment criteria, so therefore, we should invest in some of these bad things. That actually, I would say, galvanised people who were calling for divestment, and so when this debate came up, say about a month after the Scottish Church of Scotland debated divestment, the Scottish Episcopal Church voted massively in favour of divestment. So I think there's a sense in which there can be some positive competition sometimes, almost, or positive influence when you see another organisation in the same sector that divests. You can kind of point towards, and it perhaps works the other way in this case, where the Church of Scotland, as you saw, kind of got some not very good media publicity after voting against divestment. People in the Scottish Episcopal Church, I'm sure quite a number of them had read it and thought, actually, we need to do something about this as well. So just coming back to your question, let's say, I guess when that question comes up about who you take the money from, I think it's always important to think through, number one, is it ethical? Which I think is the same question in terms of, should others invest in the fossil fuel industry? But what are the implications of this? How is this going to look, from a reputational point of view as well?
I think it's important to realize that the fossil fuel companies are thoroughly spooked by this movement. And soon it'll be too big to call it a movement. This is the world saying, these guys are the problem. And so the fossil fuel companies are doing everything that they can to try to save their reputations. And it's called greenwashing, and it's ubiquitous. And I think that we just, all of us, wherever we are, whenever we see it, we just have to speak out. We just have to say, that's ridiculous. They can't claim to be supporting a livable planet when this is what they're doing and making all of their bajillions of dollars or whatever. I mean, it's really extraordinary. And I think all we have to do is call it by its name when it happens. But we have to, all of us, speak out.
Thank you very much. My name is Ilana Greilen. I come from Limpopo. And I'm so glad to hear what you guys are saying. It's just like I feel I live on another planet. At this stage, I live in the Lepelale area where Eskom has built Medupi power station. And it's like everybody and his friend Jack wants to invest in coal in that area. We've got so many proposed coal projects there. We've got investors from Australia, from Japan, from India, from China. It's just like a coal rush. And none of the arguments we have all been hearing this morning, I mean, we've tried that, but it's like, no, it's not applicable. Suddenly it's not applicable there. These people just don't listen. So what would you recommend us to do?
I can take a stab at this. So the remaining parts of the coal industry, I think, is utterly fascinating. It's a dying industry. Everybody knows it. What we see now is a dead cat bounce, basically.
What?
Dead cat bounce.
Dead cat bounce.
Yes. I'm also extremely surprised by seeing all these governments and banks and institutions that are still putting money into coal. And it is some misguided, I mean, I have looked into Japan quite a bit. I'm sure that Shin here can correct me if I'm wrong. But there you have a government who wants to be a good neighbor that sort of gently instructs their government institutions to make sure that their publicly traded banks invest money in new coal-fired capacity outside of Japan, which is, you know, it's very complicated, and it's extremely silly, but it is some kind of geopolitical game going on. And what to do? I think I promise you that we from the outside are trying to do everything we can to stop that money flow, using every tool that we have in the box. And then I think to try to identify alternatives is a good idea, because I think one thing we talk about divestment, but investment is the other side. And what I hear from Northern Europe now more and more, it's not that it's a lack of money, it's a lack of projects. Whether it's true or not, I think lack of bankable projects maybe. But we have a job to do there.
I just want to pick up, Janet, on your legislation and the TCFD, and I know this gets, but TCFD defines physical risk and transition risk, and which is a nicer wording. Physical risk is climate havoc, and so, but if you have a universal investor, if you own the entire investment universe, and you can say that $1 trillion fund does, so your pension fund, the Norwegian, there's a Dutch one, there's a Japanese one. You actually have the fossil fuel sector producing a lot of risk in the rest of the portfolio. So you can argue, and that's a pure financial within modern portfolio theory, that you should wind down the fossil fuel one as risk mitigation to the rest of your portfolio. And if you're speaking to a universal owner, that person cannot argue, well, that doesn't affect my portfolio because you're that big. And that's an argument that might be used in a context where the TCFD is in play, and in high finance it is sometimes.
Well, one of the things we did, we followed up on the passage of the law with a series of letters to the fund that essentially lay out a reporting protocol that is very closely aligned with the TCFD, and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures doesn't just talk about oil and gas. it talks about every sector you can think about, because obviously this is the whole deal. So we laid out all the sectors and the industries within the sectors and said, these are the things you need to report on. And they went, oh my goodness, that will be a very long report. We said, yeah, it will. Even if they just took the top 50 in every one of these industries within these sectors, you could see where the risk is the greatest. And I think, you know, we're talking about realigning the global economy. There's nothing else that we're talking about. And the way you do it, I believe, is to analyze that risk and start taking it off the top. And yeah, let's hope they do it.
Yeah. And I just wanted quickly on that, because just the same thing is happening in Norway. The Ministry of Finance basically ordered the Norwegian Oil Fund to do the same. And I know that they are looking specifically into, or are going to look specifically into their investments in financial institutions and how they are exposed to the fossil industry. So we are looking into a lot of disclosure and a lot of numbers and a lot of geeky time for some of us.
So it sounds like we're about out of time, but I just wanted to go through a lightning round with our panelists. If you could go back in your campaigning history and change one thing that you would have done differently, what would that be? Lightning round. So
Do you want to start that end?
I would have made sure that we managed to have a global campaign in Greenpeace on finance 5 years ago, not now.
I'm not going to answer that question. I want to talk about coal. Because I had the good fortune of sitting on an airplane for 11 hours with a young woman from Poland who is in charge of public programs and festivals in the city of Gdansk. And I tried for most of the flight, and maybe I succeeded in talking her into building some programs around opposing coal, and coal in Poland is like air. Actually, it is probably air. But I think we should come out of this conference with something for people in coal-ridden places to do, and solidarity among all of you to say, we're going to take this on, we're going to build this grassroots coal movement and share ideas going forward. I think it's the way to do it, and coal is the place to start. Sorry, Clara.
No worries. We're definitely going to have an action-oriented outcome of the summit. We're going to have plans, and we're going to follow up, and we're going to make it happen, Janet. We're going to make it happen. So just going down the line, Samia, do you want to go next?
Yeah, can I mention two?
Yeah.
One, I think more of as Save Lama, because I also used to be a member of Save Lama before DeCOALonize. I think I wish from a very long time ago we had a more, we'd started a more inclusive process from the get-go. I think unfortunately, based on just kind of circumstances that most of the fishermen, actually all of the fishermen are Muslim. And the fishermen were one of the first that went to court and one of the first on the front lines. We were easily branded with the as, oh, it's them versus us. And I think that made it much harder to become inclusive. Not that we didn't try, but it made it harder. So maybe that should have been an active effort from the beginning. Okay. Secondly, I think more of, what do you call it, not always branding somebody just because they work for government or just because they work for an investment bank or a banker that they're an enemy. I think many years ago, say, oh, well, they must be against us, so there's no point wasting our energy. There were some missed opportunities, and I think I realized that the most when we went to UNESCO forum this year to lobby on the decision by UNESCO, who did make a decision for us, saying the project should be halted until the proper research is done. But we met staff there from the National Museums of Kenya who actually, opened and said, yeah, we're against the project, we're with you. Just that we can't say it out publicly. And I think, oh man, why didn't we talk earlier? And I think opportunities weren't presented, but if I could turn back time, that's what I would do different.
Great.
I think out of the understanding that divestment is a foundation on which we build to then create the political space to advance more, I guess, more material action to disempower and dismantle the fossil fuel industry. I think what I would have done in my context, but I think actually what our entire global movement should have done is develop and strategize those next steps way, way, way earlier, like years earlier. Like we're now running a campaign, as I mentioned at the beginning, trying to get banks to start financing fossil fuels. That should have come much sooner. That should have come much sooner for us in the UK and in the university sector. It also should have come much sooner globally. And I think those campaigns, we should have, I think from the more UK specific context, we should have understood that they weren't the same as divestment. They required a different strategy, a different model, and you couldn't transpose that in some ways unique success of divestment as a tactic onto other forms of struggle, other forms of resistance against the fossil fuel industry.
I think when I started this job, I probably, I don't know, I would have expected a lot more of the churches to have divested by now, probably, if I look back 3 years. Probably I'd underestimated quite how entrenched the church was in engaging with oil and gas companies and how long they would continue doing it. So I think one thing, I think it was a bit of a turning point for our campaign, particularly the Church of England, is when the Bishop of Oxford got quite involved and he proposed a motion calling for a much faster divestment. And it was interesting to see how quickly things started to move in the Church of England when you got sort of, you know, a certain level of church leadership on board. So I think that was definitely a learning for me. I think another just brief one was involving young people in the campaigns as well. I think even more so actually now with obviously Greta Thunberg and School Strike for Climate. But yeah, those voices in the church, you know, kind of working with those people and really trying to amplify their voice, because in the end it's, you know, it's the world that we're all going to be living in, but it's the world they're going to be living in for longer.
Thank you so much. And you know, one of the core themes that kept coming up was this idea of divestment versus engagement. So you've got this huge shareholder juggernaut called the Climate Action 100+ that is $34 trillion worth of investment, and it insists that it's going to convince Exxon to stop digging, it's going to convince Shell to stop burning, it's going to somehow persuade these companies to become renewable energy companies. And we all know that's just a lie. So we prepared a Capetown declaration, which I hope every organization in this room will sign, which essentially demands that the members of the Climate Action 100+ ask the companies they engage with for immediate plans to phase out all coal, oil, and gas, or they must divest now. If you're interested in learning more, let me know. And thank you all so much. Let's give a big round of applause to our panelists.